Let's get this out of the way first. Racism is real, and racism has had significant impact on our world throughout history. Actual racism is something that should be stopped when it arises. However, the way that many people handle racism has led to significant problems and is a huge part of what is causing our country's current riots and mass destruction. A Marxism based theoretical framework has risen which relies heavily on the flawed ideas of identity politics. This is known as critical race theory, and it throws groups into sets of predisposed oppressors and oppressed. It tries to say that racism is present in every aspect of our lives, even when no real racism is there, and that certain groups will always be predisposed to discriminating against other groups even if they don't mean to. It claims that there is systemic hidden racism throughout every aspect of our society and suggests that if you are part of the oppressor group, then you should remain silent about your own opinion of certain topics because you aren't capable of separating objective facts from your alleged inherent subjective bias. For example, critical race theory identifies white people as oppressors and people of color as the oppressed. It suggests that white people will always have an aspect of oppression toward black people and other people of color as a matter of their own nature, so white people should avoid expressing their opinion about certain things because their opinion will always be racist to some extent. Critical race theory goes further than just race. This is by definition discriminatory towards white, straight, cis males. This is one of the major problems with critical race theory. Even though it presents itself as trying to counter oppression and racism, it actually encourages discrimination against the groups it identifies as oppressors and oppresses them, even if those people haven't actually been guilty of discriminating against others. Under critical race theory, it doesn't matter if you are individually guilty of racism or oppression. If you are a member of one of these groups that critical race theory identifies as perpetual oppressors, then you are automatically guilty of oppression because oppression is built into your thought process by the system that raised you. Even if no oppression is actually there, critical race theory encourages people to search for signs of oppression in every aspect of every interaction in their lives, which causes people to claim that there is racism and oppression even if there isn't, or causes them to mistakenly feel that something is oppression without looking at every aspect of the situation. For example, proponents of critical race theory are protesting, rioting, and destroying property about systemic racism due to the police shooting Walter Wallace Jr., ignoring the fact that Mr. Wallace advanced on officers with a knife in his hand and ignored orders to drop the knife before being shot. Also ignoring the fact that they had been called out to that location over 30 times for disturbances, some involving weapons. Because Wallace was black, many people claim that racism played into the shooting and are demanding that the officers be prosecuted while they're destroying their own city. Critical race theory has become mainstream and is heavily popular among far-left liberals. Our social justice warrior society has decided to try to implement critical race theory into every aspect of our education and careers, drilling it into our heads. On September 22, 2020, President Trump banned the federal government from hiring contractors to conduct critical race theory or related training, understanding the unnecessary problems that extreme forms of this training cause. Critical race theory causes people to search for oppression even when oppression isn't there. It lumps people into groups for identity politics. It tells people that they cannot have an opinion on certain topics because of the groups they are in, and it leads to serious problems that we can clearly see in our society today. Critical race theory claims to combat racism, sexism, and discrimination, but it actually encourages these things. It tries to eliminate our social order and replace it with some sort of utopian society, but all it does is cause a further divide. It must be eliminated if we are ever supposed to actually unite again. If you oppose critical race theory in any way, you are considered to be part of the problem based on privilege, such as white privilege. If you argue with critical race theory in any way, you're considered a fascist, even if you try to use evidence. Critical race theory is a farce that's being used to abuse Black Lives Matter, to push that movement into a communist movement, and to abuse people's emotions.
Was just in a video of a black Israelite demanding a white woman kiss his boots, and she did it. This is where this leads to, people. This is where this oppressed mentality leads to. I have seen several videos where white people are shamed into, hey, we're from Black Lives Matter, and we want to promote the justice of black people, and so here we go. You need to, renounce your whiteness, bow down, enter into this lament, kiss our boots. I have seen several. When I say several, I mean many. I have seen many people being led in prayers of repentance for their whiteness. This is where this leads. If you think that critical race theory is just a cute theory or framework, for us to be able to understand the ills of society, you are sadly mistaken. Do not adopt this framework, because it will lead you down a path of worship for someone else, a path of repenting to someone else. I am sorry. I can only say black people ain't your God. If you are white and you feel like you need to bow down and repent to a black person, you are sadly mistaken. You are on the wrong train. And that might not sound nice and be a gracious stand, but you know what? I'd rather let you know boldly than to kind of placate your emotions. This is wrong. This is where this leads. It leads to white people feeling like they need to lament and repent of their whiteness and kiss somebody's boots. The devil is a lie.
Well, let's have some real talk about white culture. We highly emphasize empathy in our culture. And I think that there's a lot of white people who are like, hey, I want to empathize. I want to be compassionate. And maybe I can make all these hard feelings kind of calm down if I show up and be empathetic. But you have to know that that's not going to be enough. That's not where this train leads. The goal of critical race theory for the thought leaders, for the people who really buy into this as a framework and a life principle, is their goal is to become the oppressors. That they will crush white culture. They're going to smash the patriarchy, and they're going to smash the what they perceive as be the affluence, the privilege of whites and white culture.
And you might not get this from a Christian who upholds to CRT. They're just going to talk about equity and equality. But let me keep it real. That is not the end goal. The end goal is the end of the white male patriarchy by any means necessary. James Cone, who was a black theologian, he talked about liberation theology in I don't even remember the name of the book that I'm reading by him, but he literally says, by any means necessary. And we will take some of you guys with us. If it means death, we will take some of you guys with us. Don't fall for it. I'm telling you now, do not fall for it. Black Lives Matter, don't fall for it. I'm black. Okay, look, I got melanin. I love my melanin. I'm going to go ahead and let you know now, I am not ashamed to be black. But I will not jump on board with something that does not promote a Christian ethos. Black Lives Matter, and everybody wants to hashtag Black Lives Matter, and white silence is violence. And if you are white and you don't promote Black Lives Matter, then you're just a part of the problem. No, wait a minute. Have you looked on their website? Have you looked at the about for Black Lives Matter? They have in their agenda, it's part of the dismantling of the nuclear family. That's a problem, because God created the family in Genesis. It's a problem when they want to dismantle the black family and then promote the black trans. It's a problem when you want to dismantle the black family and yet black females have the highest abortion rate out of all races. It's a problem that you want to dismantle the black family and yet black poverty is so high. Black Lives Matter is not really about all Black life matters. No, they have an agenda too. And when you jump on board with the hashtag of Black Lives Matters, you are promoting an agenda that is antithetical to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Black Lives Matter does not care about the black father. Since we on the subject and people want to know, let's be real. If you are white, don't let social media guilt you into being on the wrong train.
Society is only truly civilized only to the degree that its laws reflect justice, that they have just laws, and that these laws are equally applied to everyone. Because we know that justice is supposed to be blind. Justice does not worry about our gender or our race or our socioeconomic status. Justice is to be blind. Martin Luther King summarized this truth when he said that he wanted his children to be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Justice is blind. It doesn't recognize race. It simply assesses actions. And so as we reflect on justice and true laws, we have to draw attention, dear friends, to a popular influence in our society and in our culture. I speak specifically in our world today of the return of the critical theory. Now, this is a popular view in the beginning of the 20th century, and it kind of faded away, but it's returned. The critical theory tells people that they are defined solely by an attribute, by their gender, their race, their economic status, or by a lifestyle, the working class or the LGBTQ. The theory then seeks to rally a group based on the identified trait. It tells the group with the attribute that it is a victim and is being oppressed, and that the only way it can be truly liberated is by completely overturning the entire social structure that the theory claims is oppressing the identified group. This is a dangerous theory. In our day, the critical theory is focused on race. Critical race theory tells people that they are only identified, they are only truly persons by the color of their skin. And it claims that everyone who is not a part of this racial group or any institution that was not founded by members of this racial group is inherently racist. It is oppressive and it is unjust. Now please note, the theory tells us that just because we are not the member of a specific racial group, we are therefore de facto racists. Critical race theory is an unjust theory that leads to chaos and reverse discrimination. The theory inverses justice, using the name justice while betraying and undermining the very substance of true justice. This is the theory that is behind the lie of systemic racism. It is the philosophy behind the Black Lives Matter Incorporated and by Antifa. Imagine if I were to say to this section of the church, all the women in this section, you are oppressed and you are being victimized, and everyone else in this part of the group, because they're not women, therefore are sexist, and you must get rid of them. You have to overthrow them. Why would a theory do that? This is a Marxist theory, dear friends. It's the philosophy behind communism. Communism despises democratic and free societies. This is a philosophy that is used to purposely cause tension within society so as to overthrow not only democratic government, but to overthrow organized religion. This is a dangerous theory that has found a wide reception here in the United States. As Christians, we are opposed to the critical theory, and to critical race theory, and its claim of systemic racism. Since we judge people by their actions, we judge laws, and specific state of affairs. Unlike this wayward theory, we don't look at a person's skin color. We look rather at the content of their character. We look at specific actions, laws, and state of affairs. We don't paint broadly with a wide brush. For example, here are a few examples of unjust laws. Historically, the anti-Semitic laws of National Socialism, which led to the Holocaust. These were unjust laws passed by a legislative body. They were unjust, and they should have been disobeyed by people of goodwill, and they were. And many of those heroes died in the concentration camps themselves. Or we can look at the segregation laws in our own country. They were bad laws telling one person, one group, because of their race, they could not participate in the public services that another race could have. These were unjust laws, and they were overturned. They motivated the civil rights movement, and we changed society. Or perhaps in our own day, we look at the abortion laws, in which society tells mothers that they can kill their children in their most vulnerable stage. And we say that that is a just law, but it is a lie. That is an unjust law that is to be opposed by people of goodwill. We are to refuse these laws and pray for the quick overturn of Roe v. Wade. These are unjust laws. They violate justice. They do not give to another what is their due. Now, here are some examples of justice naming and fixing unjust laws. When I was a child living in West Germany, my father served in the military. Now, we were in the Cold War. I didn't know what that meant. Cold War, East, West. I thought every school child had armed guards on their school bus. I thought every neighborhood had a 10:30 curfew with military police and German shepherds, right? That's just life. But growing up in West Germany, my parents took advantage of the opportunity to take us to certain historical places in order to learn history. One of those places was the courthouse in Nuremberg. You might recall that in 1948, the civilized nations of the world convened a court in Nuremberg in order to put on trial the leaders of Nazism. And the leaders of Nazism claimed that they were only following the law. They were doing what they were told. And the civilized nations of the world denounced that and said there are times in which we are called to be martyrs. You cannot hide behind an unjust law in order to slaughter the innocent. And the civilized nations of the world executed the vast majority of the Nazi leadership because of their unjust actions, their racist actions. Here's another example. When I was in high school, I had to read Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. I'm grieved to hear that high school students don't read that anymore. I hope that all of you have read the letter from a Birmingham jail. If for no other reason, because he quotes St. Thomas Aquinas, one of our saints. Go Catholics, right? But more importantly, because Dr. King, in the letter from a Birmingham jail, it was a letter he had to sneak out while being imprisoned for his protests. He had to sneak out portions of the letter. In the letter, he talks about justice and a healthy society. He talks about unjust laws. Much of what I preach today, Dr. King summarizes in the letter from a Birmingham jail. That letter went on to motivate the civil rights movement. And we saw a civil movement, a social movement, overturn unjust laws and change society. As Christians, if there is racism, we name it, and we seek to overturn any expression of racism. We do not unjustly claim that an entire system or that everyone outside of a specific group is racist. This is unjust. We cannot, in justice, claim that someone is a racist or violating justice simply because they are not the member of a designated victim group. As Christians, and people who love free society, we should be very cautious of the critical theory. It is a Marxist principle. Again, the philosophy behind communism, which despises the Roman Catholic Church. And it is purposely used to create tension within society and to overthrow democratic government, we have seen this historically, and to undermine organized religion. Make no mistake about it, dear friends, the critical theory is evil and is a clear violation of true justice. As Christians, we are vehemently opposed to this theory. Again, we judge people by their actions. We judge specific laws or state of affairs. When there is something unjust, we change them. We labor, we protest, we pray. We seek to change that specific state of affairs, that law, or we seek to change this person. We cannot in justice say simply because someone is not of a group, of a specific gender or race, that therefore they are racist or sexist. That's unjust. Unjust to the dignity of every human person. Dear friends, I hope that this review of justice and law has been helpful to you. Overall, I pray that this series on contemporary issues has been helpful to you in the formation of your conscience, so that each of us, wherever we might be, can seek to be kind, to do justice, and to walk humbly with God, and that every day, from the depths of our heart, we might offer God truly our 5 loaves and 2 fish.
So today we've asked Chris Rufo to walk us through some of what is happening here. You should know the details. Rufo is a research fellow at the Discovery Institute as well as a contributing editor at City Journal, and he joins us now. Chris Rufo, thanks so much for coming on. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much. You know, Tucker, this is something I've been investigating for the last 6 months, and it's absolutely astonishing how critical race theory has pervaded every institution in the federal government. And what I've discovered is that critical race theory has become, in essence, the default ideology of the federal bureaucracy and is now being weaponized against the American people. I'd like to share 3 investigations that I've unleashed that show the kind of depth of this critical race theory, cult indoctrination, and the danger and destruction it can wreak. First, the Treasury Department. I broke the story on the Treasury Department, which held a seminar earlier this year from a man named Howard Ross, a diversity trainer who has billed the federal government more than $5 million over the past 15 years, conducting seminars on critical race theory. And he told Treasury employees essentially that America was a fundamentally white supremacist country, and I quote, virtually all white people uphold the system of racism and white superiority, and was essentially denouncing the country and asking white employees at the Treasury Department and affiliated organizations to accept their white privilege, accept their white racial superiority, and accept essentially all of the baggage that comes with this reducible essence of whiteness. Second, this is not by any means limited to the Treasury Department. Critical race theory has actually now infiltrated our criminal justice system. Just this week, I released a story that the FBI is now holding weekly seminars on intersectionality, which is a hard left academic theory that reduces people to a network of racial, gender, and sexual orientation identities that intersect in complex ways and determine whether you are an oppressor or oppressed. Obviously, with the white straight male, such as FBI Director Christopher Wray, being at the top of this pyramid of evil. And third, this is a major story. Critical race theory is now infiltrating into our scientific establishment. A few weeks ago, I released a story that critical race theorists at the Sandia National Laboratories, which creates our nuclear weapons arsenal, sent their white male executives on a 3-day re-education camp to deconstruct their white male culture and actually force them to write letters of apology to women and people of color. Whistleblowers within Sandia National Laboratories have now spoken out, but laboratory executives have dispatched counterintelligence teams to quickly erase their communications, silence, and shut them down. And this is really the bottom line. There are some great people in D.C., such as Senator Josh Hawley in Missouri, that are starting to push back. But conservatives need to wake up that this is an existential threat to the United States, and the bureaucracy, even under the Trump administration, is now being weaponized against core traditional American values. And I'd like to make it explicit. The President and the White House, it's within their authority and power to immediately issue an executive order abolishing critical race theory trainings from the federal government. And I call on the President to immediately issue this executive order and stamp out this destructive, divisive, pseudo-scientific ideology at its root. And I think that it's something that he's denounced, this kind of Black Lives Matter and neo-Marxist rhetoric in places like Portland and Seattle. But it's time to take action and destroy it within his own administration.
The consequences of what you described are profound. I think we're seeing some of them now on our streets. But I want to get to the second example because it may be the most troubling of all, the Department of Justice. So the underlying idea behind our entire justice system is that all of us are treated equally under the laws of the United States. Your race, your gender, who you sleep with are irrelevant in the eyes of the law. How could the FBI, which is armed and empowered to uphold those laws, be disseminating lies like this, which are exactly contrary to their mission? I mean, how corrosive is that? How scary is that?
It's extremely corrosive, and what we're seeing is that the institutions of the federal government, the actual bureaucracies and agencies and this kind of permanent administrative state has really abandoned the core American principles of equality under the law, of judging individuals as individuals on their merits, and they're now adapting this radical left ideology of judging people from their group identity, and it's absolutely terrifying that the FBI, which has almost kind of plenary physical authority in the United States, would be adapting this ideology. And I think it's a red alert moment, and all Americans should be deeply worried about their country.
They should be. This has nothing to do with this election. It has to do with our future as a nation. Very quickly, there are reports that this is going on in the United States military. Is that true?
Yeah, I've had some leaks from inside the U.S. military, in the Air Force and the Navy. I'm still working on these stories to source them, to confirm them. But what I can say is this, is that they are essentially, starting in 2011 with an Obama executive order, mandating diversity and inclusion initiatives throughout the federal government. They've created these offices of diversity and inclusion who ostensibly are supporting greater diversity, but in practice, according to sources throughout the federal government, serve as almost internal intelligence services to perpetuate this ideology and to root out conservative ideas and ultimately purge conservative employees.
A diverse country can't handle this for long. We need to be unified by our equality under the law, or we won't be unified. And by the way, if there are people watching this who've experienced it, I hope you'll reach out to us whistleblowers within the military or other federal agencies. Will reach out to Chris Rufo or to us, because we're going to keep on this story. Chris Rufo, thanks so much for your report tonight. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mike, great Vice President. I'm truly honored to be here at the very first White House Conference on American History, so important. Our mission is to defend the legacy of America's founding, the virtue of America's heroes, and the nobility of the American character. We must clear away the twisted web of lies in our schools and classrooms and teach our children the magnificent truth about our country. We want our sons and daughters to know that they are the citizens of the most exceptional nation in the history of the world. To grow up in America is to live in a land where anything is possible, where anyone can rise, and where any dream can come true, all because of the immortal principles of our nation's founders, inscribed nearly 2.5 centuries ago. That's why we've come to the National Archives, the sacred home of our national memory. In this great chamber, we preserve our glorious inheritance, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. On this very day in 1787, our founding fathers signed the Constitution at Independence Hall in Philadelphia. It was the fulfillment of 1,000 years of Western civilization. Our Constitution was the product of centuries of tradition, wisdom, and experience. No political document has done more to advance the human condition or propel the engine of progress. Yet as we gather this afternoon, a radical movement is attempting to demolish this treasured and precious inheritance. We can't let that happen. Left-wing mobs have torn down statues of our founders, desecrated our memorials, and carried out a campaign of violence and anarchy. Far-left demonstrators have chanted the words, "America was never great." The left has launched a vicious and violent assault on law enforcement, the universal symbol of the rule of law in America. These radicals have been aided and abetted by liberal politicians, establishment media, and even large corporations. Whether it is the mob on the street or the cancel culture in the boardroom, the goal is the same: to silence dissent, to scare you out of speaking the truth, and to bully Americans into abandoning their values, their heritage, and their very way of life. We are here today to declare that we will never submit to tyranny. We will reclaim our history and our country for citizens of every race, color, religion, and creed. The radicals burning American flags want to burn down the principles enshrined in our founding documents, including the bedrock principle of equal justice under law, in order to radically transform America. They must first cause Americans to lose confidence in who we are, where we came from, and what we believe. As I said at Mount Rushmore, which they would love to rip down and rip it down fast, that's never going to happen. 2 months ago, the left-wing cultural revolution is designed to overthrow the American Revolution. As many of you testified today, the left-wing rioting and mayhem are the direct result of decades of left-wing indoctrination in our schools. It's gone on far too long. Our children are instructed from propaganda tracks like those of Howard Zinn that try to make students ashamed of their own history. The left has warped, distorted, and defiled the American story with deceptions, falsehoods, and lies. There is no better example than the New York Times totally discredited 1619 Project. This project rewrites American history to teach our children that we were founded on the principle of oppression, not freedom. Nothing could be further from the truth. America's founding set in motion the unstoppable chain of events that abolished slavery, secured civil rights, defeated communism and fascism, and built the most fair, equal, and prosperous nation in human history. The narratives about America being pushed by the far left and being chanted in the streets bear a striking resemblance to the anti-American propaganda of our adversaries, because both groups want to see America weakened, derided, and totally diminished. Students in our universities are inundated with critical race theory. This is a Marxist doctrine, holding that America is a wicked and racist nation, that even young children are complicit in oppression, and that our entire society must be radically transformed. Critical race theory is being forced into our children's schools. It's being imposed into workplace trainings, and it's being deployed to rip apart friends, neighbors, and families. A perfect example of critical race theory was recently published by the Smithsonian Institution. This document alleged that concepts such as hard work, rational thinking, and the nuclear family and belief in God were not values that unite all Americans, but were instead aspects of whiteness. This is offensive and outrageous to Americans of every ethnicity, and it's especially harmful to children of minority backgrounds who should be uplifted, not disparaged. Teaching this horrible doctrine to our children is a form of child abuse in the truest sense of those words. For many years now, the radicals have mistaken Americans' silence for weakness, but they're wrong. There is no more powerful force than a parent's love for their children, and patriotic moms and dads are going to demand that their children are no longer fed hateful lies about this country. American parents are not going to accept indoctrination in our schools, cancel culture in our work, or the repression of traditional faith, culture, and values in the public square. Not anymore.
This month, your administration directed federal agencies to end racial sensitivity training that addresses white privilege or critical race theory. Why did you decide to do that, to end racial sensitivity training? And do you believe that there is systemic racism in this country, sir?
I ended it because it's racist. I ended it because a lot of people were complaining that they were asked to do things that were absolutely insane, that it was a radical revolution that was taking place in our military, in our schools, all over the place, and you know it, and so does everybody else.
Radical,
and he would know.
What is
it was
radical
totally
about
racist.
racial sensitivity training, sir?
If you were a certain person, you had no status in life. It was sort of a reversal. And if you look at the people, we were paying people hundreds of thousands of dollars to teach very bad ideas and, frankly, very sick ideas. And really, they were teaching people to hate our country. And I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to allow that to happen. We have to go back to the core values of this country. They were teaching people that our country is a horrible place, it's a racist place, and they were teaching people to hate our country. And I'm not going to allow that to happen.
This is Trump's reversal of some of the madness. Tell us what he's been doing.
This is great news. We had Chris Rufo on the show last week, and it has been bearing fruit around the United States right now. Trump's executive order is causing higher education institutions to cancel their diversity equity programs, which are really just code for that toxic critical race theory, which divides people up by race, which tells white people that they need to be on a constant state of apology, and it is now having real effects on universities. This is another reason why Donald Trump has to win in November, because you know that this is exactly the sort of thing that will be started up immediately should Biden-Harris get into office.
I wanted to share with you. According to Pew Research, the net worth of white families in 2013 was $141,000. For black families, it was $11,000, even less than the $19,000 it was in 2007. According to economist Edward Wolf of the University of New York, excluding vehicles and other durables, the median black family worth is just $1,700, while 40% of black families have zero or negative wealth. White family worth, in terms of financial worth, is 69 times more than that of black families. Given this disparity, how can you argue that racism is not a driving factor in income inequality?
Because it has nothing to do with race and everything to do with culture. And when you have a culture that doesn't, you know what? Explain to me. You explain to me why black kids aren't graduating high school. Explain that one to me. Explain to me why black kids are shooting each other in rates significantly higher than whites are shooting each other. Explain to me why 13% of the population is responsible for 50% of the murder. Explain to me why the number of black kids in prison, not for innocent reasons, not for walking down the street and getting pulled into a prison, is so high. Explain, if it has nothing to do with culture, explain to me why the single motherhood rate in the black community jumped from 20% to 70% in the same course of time that the civil rights movement has made such tremendous strides. Is America more racist now than it was in 1960? And if it is, please explain to me how that happened.
So what do I think those riots are? I think the depravity, I think they're thugs, and I think if you really want to make a difference, Thurgood Marshall, who grew up just 2 blocks from there, did such a thing, who was a contemporary of Martin Luther King.
Now I'd like to skip over to Dr. Seacrest.
I look at the Baltimore uprisings as more than just riots, right? I hate the idea when you say thugs and riots, right? White people riot as well. When y'all win Super Bowls 2 years in a row, y'all get off the hook. Don't make it seem like it's just Baltimore getting upset. So my 30-second answer is I feel the frustration of what's happening in the community, and I think it's a symptom. The uprisings are a symptom of a pressure that's been unaddressed for too long.
I'm offended by the language of uprising applied to people who are breaking into other black people's stores and looting them. This is a lack of values. And people who are destroying private property, destroying cop cars, in an uprising against what exactly? Against the black police chief, against a mostly minority police force, against the black mayor, against the black president, against the black attorney general, against against a city council that is 9 of 15 are black and all 15 are elected Democrats. What is the uprising against? What is it seeking to achieve? I still don't see what exactly the riots are seeking to achieve. Bottom line is, this is all, it all could be boiled down to just act like a mensch. Act like a human being. Honestly, it's not useful to riot, it's not useful to break things, it's not useful to throw rocks at people. And the idea that we're supposed to sort of correlate your level of outrage.
I'm going to stick to the 30 seconds on
this.
The
last
Charles?
sentence. The last sentence.
Yeah.
The idea that we're supposed to correlate your level of outrage with a certain level of justification. In other words, the more outraged you are and the more angry you are, the more justified you must be, is absolute nonsense.
Then, since the issue of disparity has come up a number of times, when does disparity not indicate racism?
Level of effort.
Statistical disparity. For example, overwhelmingly men commit crimes more than women, but we don't say that the Justice Department is sexist. So, is there a line that you draw for yourself, or is there some way that you interpret statistical disparity and you determine that that is not a racial disparity, it's something else? Well, we can return to it. That's okay too. Ben, do you want to?
Yes. It's called evidence of racism. When there is no evidence of racism, it's probably not racism. When there is actual evidence of racism, it's probably racism. And the fact that everybody jumps from there's inequality and therefore there is inequity, just because there's inequality does not mean there was inequity.
But there has to be racism. You can't say there's no racism.
Without evidence?
No. I'm just saying that I don't know which animal. Maybe we're talking about dogs or something. I'm talking about human beings, and I'm like, human beings are most likely going to have racial prejudices. I'm just so sorry. I'm just so sorry. I don't know. I come from planet Earth.
Charles, I want to ask you a question. So your default is that when there is no evidence, racism is the deciding factor. That is
no, it's not saying that. I'm just saying that you're going to have sexists, you're going to have racists, you're going to have all this stuff. I mean, I'm just saying that.
I agree it exists, but the problem that I'm seeing, and this is the problem with the general conversation, is that there's no solution in simply saying there's racism out there. How does that solve anything? I mean, when you talk about there's institutional racism, what does that mean? Show me a law that is racist in intent, and we will agree. Show me a police officer who commits a racist act like we saw in South Carolina, right, where a police officer shot a black man running away and it was obviously unjustified, and I will agree. But the idea that you can craft a narrative based on no racism because it just must be somewhere out there in the ether, that doesn't solve problems for anybody and creates more problems for people because now they grow up in a milieu and an environment where they are told that every obstacle they face is from some shadowy, nameless, faceless group who's out to get them simply because of the color of their skin. They'll never succeed in that environment.
You know, the weirdest thing is that actually in the black home, as I experienced it, really, there is no discussion of racism. Racism actually is a discussion that you actually come out and you face in the public because it's a real thing that you have to actually expect. I mean, you're silly and you're foolish if you don't really think that that's going to be there and encountered in the real world. I'm sorry, this is just a fact of life. But if I'm at home and having dinner with my father or whatever, we don't go, oh my God, this society is so racist as I'm eating my steak, and you know what I mean? Oh, goodness gracious. Oh, I can't bear it. My black skin's causing. I mean, no, we don't talk like that. Actually, we don't talk like that. We talk about, my God, Aunt, what's her name? Oh my God, she's got to take some pills because she's off the register. I mean, it's just like these are the conversations we have at home. We don't have these kinds of conversations that we're having right now. At least in my childhood, we didn't have them. And I'm watching the people I knew growing up in the black neighborhood, I didn't hear anybody really talking about race when we were at the dinner table. I mean, it just didn't really pop up, unless it was an issue, it was on television, but mostly it was about family and regular life.
But I disagree. I have to tell you, even in my culture, there is an underlying racism. And I know that the panel today, and especially with what's going on in America, we're talking about white on black. But I cannot wake up in the morning and not think about, intercultural racism, okay? I'm not Mexican enough. Why? Because I'm articulate and because I have straight hair and I can wear high heels. I don't have a tattoo on my neck. Yes, there is a huge problem with racism no matter if you're light-skinned or dark-skinned. Absolutely, there is intercultural racism. It's absolutely underlying. And why you may not talk about it, your grandmother will have the favorite grandkid if she's the lightest one with the good hair. that becomes the favorite grandkid in our culture. And that's, unfortunately, even within our own cultures, we tend to look upon, the color of each other's skin and how much education we have. And if my uncle has done time in jail, which, he has, then he becomes more Mexican than I am. What is up with that? I mean, it's sad, but it's true. It's absolutely true. It's like I can't eat spicy picante sauce, so I'm not Mexican enough. It's true, in every culture, whether it's Asian, Black, Mexican, there is, while you may not have grown up talking about it over your, tea and toast.
I mean, in my family, if you're not a doctor or a lawyer, you're not Jewish
enough. You're not Jewish enough. It's true.
That part is true. This entire time, I've been trying to think about your initial question about disparities. Are they automatically tied to race? And at first, I think all of us were stumped because we were trying to think of the instances. I do agree that they are separate, that they don't necessarily correlate within itself. There are disparities. NAACP, we are the experts inside of the nation of bringing in the racial lens for all of the work. No, they're not necessarily going hand in hand, or they're not necessarily tied to each other. So that's how I would answer it. No, they don't have to go together. My job as a civil rights attorney is to be able to make you see race at every given opportunity, but no, it's not present in each and every single disparity. To your second...
What are the standards? What are the standards, the difference? I mean, you said that you want people to see race in every single issue.
Where
so
it's present. Where it's present.
Okay,
so for instance, if we're
what's
talking...
your standard as to where it's present?
Absolutely. What's my... take something as simple as if we're talking about a disparity, say men and women. My job would be to show what does that look like when you have women from a different group, communities of color. What does it look like when we're talking about a woman who's working or stuck in a minimum wage job, not as a starter, but for her career?
Right. No, I guess the
what does
question
that
I'm
look
asking
like?
more
And so
specifically.
we bring in the racial dynamic of how that affects.
No, I understand that. The question that I'm asking is, when do you decide something racist has occurred?
Racist?
Yes. When can you decide that an act of racism has occurred? Because if you have just a statistical disparity, has an act of racism automatically occurred? That was David's basic question, I think.
Right. There's obviously there might be there will be a disparate impact on different groups of people. That doesn't necessarily mean, I think what you're saying is, doesn't necessarily mean something racist is going on, even though there's a racial impact. So the question was about where do you draw the line between something that might have a racial impact but is not inherently racist? Yeah.
The question was, if there is unconscious bias, just to repeat it so I'm making sure I get it right, if there is unconscious bias, how does white privilege not exist?
The question is, given that there is unconscious bias, how does white privilege not exist?
So number one, so when I speak about white privilege, yes, so when I speak about white privilege, I'm speaking specifically about behavior. Okay, there have been no studies, and really I've looked at these studies, the connection between what they call implicit bias, this is their favorite phrase now, implicit bias, unconscious bias, and biased behavior has yet to be proven at any level that is even remotely necessary to be used in, for example, a courtroom, which is why it's never been used in a courtroom. It is also true that there is no way, there really isn't, there's been no proven way to alleviate what they call unconscious bias, which means that we're ghost hunting. So what I would suggest is that if there is unconscious bias, and I'll acknowledge the possibility or the reality of unconscious bias, if there is, then I need you to I don't care about what's in people's heads so much as what they do. So if you point me to a racist behavior, don't worry, I'll let you respond. If you point me to a racist behavior, I'm happy to stand alongside you and protest it. What I can't do is protest about things in people's head that I don't know about because I'm not a mind reader.
Okay, so that's a really interesting response, and to that I have two questions. Firstly, what I've heard you say that this is something that, the way people think doesn't affect their behavior. So that's the first thing you've said. So I'm really curious if you can kind of give me another example of a thought that somebody has which doesn't affect their behavior. Like, do people who, support Trump not vote for him? Like, I'm very curious about that.
Yes.
And secondly, so the second thing that I want to ask is that if it's something it's hard to fix, does it mean we shouldn't do anything about it? Because you said, I don't know if we can change how people think. Does that mean we shouldn't try?
I mean, first of all, not a great impression. But beyond that, my voice isn't that low. But beyond that, as far as the first question, which is do people have thoughts that don't manifest in behavior? Yes, all the time.
For instance?
For instance, every thought that you have about walking up here and strangling me right now. I assume like we have thoughts all the time that don't manifest in behavior, and this is true every single day. We consider thoughts that cross our minds. The problem with unconscious bias is the idea is you don't even know that you're having the thought, right? So how can you stop it if you don't even know that you're having it? But then we should be able to gauge the unconscious bias and its impact on behavior. That's why it's unconscious bias as opposed to conscious bias. Right? The idea behind unconscious bias is that it's not even a ghost, it's a ghost of a ghost, because you don't even know you're having the thought. So people, the whole idea behind diversity training is the idea that you can retrain people to stop their chain of thought in order so that it doesn't manifest in behavior. I don't think that every thought manifests in behavior. If it did, then every time a man saw a good-looking woman walk down the street, a straight man saw a good-looking woman down the street, we'd have a real mess on our hands. So the second question, the idea was a little too broad for me to respond to, which is just because something is tough, don't we have to face up to it? Yes, we have to face up to tough things all the time. And one of the tough things I would suggest that we face up to is that you have a lot more control over your own behavior and the decisions you make than the supposedly widespread unconscious bias of people you've never met. It's an honor to testify. It's an honor to testify before you here today. The reason that I'm with you is that I speak on dozens of college campuses every year, so I have some firsthand experience with the anti-First Amendment activities that have been taking place on the college campuses. I've encountered anti-free speech measures, administrative cowardice, even physical violence at campuses ranging from California State University at Los Angeles to University of Wisconsin at Madison, which is driving the legislation that Ms. Demings was talking about, to Penn State University to UC Berkeley, and I am not alone. In order to understand what's been going on at some of our college campuses, it's necessary to explore the ideology that provides the impetus for a lot of the protesters who violently obstruct events, pull fire alarms, assault professors and even other students, and the impetus for administrators who all too often humor these protesters. Free speech is under assault because of a three-step argument made by the advocates and justifiers of violence. The first step is they say that the validity or invalidity of an argument can be judged solely by the ethnic, sexual, racial, or cultural identity of the person making the argument. The second step is that they claim those who say otherwise are engaging in what they call verbal violence. And the final step is they conclude that physical violence is sometimes justified in order to stop such verbal violence. So let's examine each of these three steps in turn. First, the philosophy of intersectionality. This philosophy now dominates college campuses as well as a large segment, unfortunately, of today's Democratic Party, and suggests that straight white Americans are inherently the beneficiaries of white privilege and therefore cannot speak on certain policies, since they have not experienced what it's like to be black or Hispanic or gay or transgender or a woman. This philosophy ranks the value of a view not based on the logic or merit of the view, but on the level of victimization in American society experienced by the person espousing the view. Therefore, if you're an LGBT black woman, your view of American society is automatically more valuable than that of a straight white male. The next step in the logic is obvious. If a straight white male, or anybody else who ranks lower on the victimhood scale, says something contrary to the viewpoint of the higher-ranking intersectionality identity, that person has engaged in a microaggression. As NYU social psychologist Jonathan Haidt writes, microaggressions are small actions or word choices that seem on their face to have no malicious intent, but that are thought of as a kind of violence nonetheless. You don't have to actively say anything insulting to microaggress. Somebody merely needs to take offense. If, for example, you say that society ought to be colorblind, you're microaggressing certain identity groups who have been victimized by a non-colorblind society. Note, microaggressions, as the name suggests, are not merely insults. They are aggressions. They are the equivalent to physical violence. Just 2 weeks ago, psychologist Lisa Feldman Barrett of Northeastern University published an essay in the New York Times suggesting that words should be seen as physical violence because they can cause stress, and stress causes physical harm. Thus, Feldman suggested it is reasonable, scientifically speaking, to ban or restrict speech you do not like at your school. This is both inane and dangerous. That's because it leads to the final logical step. Words you don't like deserve to be fought physically. When I spoke at California State University, LA, one professor threatened students who sponsored me by offering to fight them. He then posted a slogan on the door of his office stating, "The best response to microaggression is macroaggression." As Haidt writes, this is why the idea that speech is violence is so dangerous. It tells the members of a generation already beset by anxiety and depression that the world is a far more violent and threatening place than it really is. It tells them that words, ideas, speakers can literally kill them. Even worse, at a time of rapidly rising political polarization in the United States, it helps a small subset of that generation justify political violence. Indeed, protesters all too often engage in physically violent disruption when they believe their identity group is under verbal attack by someone, usually conservative, but not always. Not only do some administrators look the other way, at Middlebury College, Cal State LA, Berkeley, Evergreen, Actual crimes were committed and almost nobody has been arrested. But they actively forbid events from moving forward, creating a heckler's veto. The notion that if you are physically violent enough, you can get administrators to kowtow to you, to bow before you, by canceling an event you disagree with altogether. All of this destroys free speech. But just as importantly, it turns students into snowflakes, craven and pathetic, looking for an excuse to be offended so they can earn points in the intersectionality Olympics and then use those points as a club with which to beat opponents. A healthy nation requires an emotionally and intellectually vigorous population ready to engage in open debate at all times. Shielding college students from opposing viewpoints makes them simultaneously weaker and more dangerous. We must fight that process at every step. And that begins by acknowledging that whatever we think about America and where we stand, we must agree on this fundamental principle. All of our views should be judged on their merits, not on the color or sex or sexual orientation of the speaker, and those views should never be banned on the grounds that they offend someone. Thanks so much.
Mr. Shapiro, you an agitator?
Not as far as I'm aware. So I think that some of what's been said does mini-skirt the debate. Mr. Krishnamurthy, I got it right. When you were talking about the Wisconsin law, I believe that law was brought up in direct counter to what happened, and it was people talked about it on the floor of the legislature. In direct counter to what happened when I spoke at University of Wisconsin at Madison, where you had a bunch of protesters who stood in front of the stage and obstructed the stage, and then refused to leave. And when I asked the police would they remove the protesters they've been going for 15 minutes. By the way, personally, two things, just to preface. I have no problem whatsoever with people protesting my speeches. I do have a problem with people who won't actually let me speak. And number two, as far as all the talk about white supremacy, I can speak from experience. Mr. Lawrence, your organization named me the #1 target of anti-Semitism online last year. So I have a trophy at my house that says #1 hated Jew in America. So I'm totally familiar with the level of vitriol that's become common in our politics. But one of the things that's a problem, and I think we have to be careful about, is when we say leave it to the administrators, and then the administrators do what they did at UW, which is the police. I said to the police, "Will you remove these protesters?" And the police said, "We have been told by the administration that if we remove the protesters, we are to shut down the event entirely. So we can't remove the protesters." We literally had to wait until they just got tired and walked out, basically. When that's the response of the administration, shouldn't there be some sort of repercussion for that? Because what I'm seeing is a heckler's veto that's taking place on campus. What I'm seeing is people who are not engaging in free speech designed to enrich the debate, but in order to shut down the debate. And there have to be some sort of ramifications for people who are actually committing trespass. I mean, this is not a question of everyone is trying to focus in on this term hate crime and hate speech. But the important part of those phrases is not the first word. It's speech versus crime. So if there's a crime that's being committed, we're all in agreement. If somebody commits a crime and they're speaking of an imminent threat to somebody, of course that's a crime. But that has very little to do with the hate and a lot more to do with the crime as to whether that's prosecuted, because hate speech is not prosecutable, nor should it be policed by the campus. So the fact is that what we are seeing is a conflation between speech and active attempts to obstruct in order to promote the obstruction by some administrators on a few college campuses.
Can you speak to how time, manner, and place restrictions are being abused?
So most obviously, UC Berkeley did that with Ann Coulter, where they kept moving around her room and they kept saying they didn't have rooms available. They said the same thing to me a week ago. There was some public outcry, and now they're offering some rooms, which I hope that event goes forward. It's not rare. They do this a lot. A private university that did it was DePaul University. I was threatened with arrest if I set foot on campus. I actually showed up there, and a security guard told me, I asked him, if I move 6 inches forward, are you going to arrest me? And he said yes, and he had the sheriff of Cook County behind him. So this is, it's become a cover for ideological discrimination, because if Ta-Nehisi Coates wants to speak on these campuses, there's not going to be any problem. The administrators will make certain that time, place, and manner restrictions don't get in the way. And this is why I say, saying that the discretion of administrators is wonderful is all well and good, except that they very often are attempting to achieve a particular political end by using means that are normally legitimate, and that's definitely a dangerous thing. If you don't mind, I have a quick note on something that I think it was Mr. Lawrence was saying earlier about the damage that's done to students by various things that happen on campus, by threats of violence and this sort of thing. And obviously, everyone, I think, agrees that what happened to Taylor is unacceptable. But one of the things that I think should also be pointed out is we have a lot of other students in the crowd and administrators who spend an enormous amount of time pushing stuff like white privilege means that you must accept that you are subordinate in terms of your view because of identity. This also has some lasting damage with regard to First Amendment exercise and with regard to how people perceive the freedom of the country. And I understand that this is universally held belief among university educators, that we have to accept the guilt of particular races or particular sexual orientations for discrimination that's happened in the past. But when you teach a bunch of 18 and 19-year-old people this, you shouldn't be surprised when, number one, they go into hiding with their viewpoint, or number two, they become frustrated. It's an absurdity to suggest that you can tell people that their viewpoints are out of line because of their identity. At the same time, you're telling other people that their viewpoints are completely in line because of their identity, and that any assault on their senses must be protected or prevented at any cost.
Well, I would just like to point out in closing that the group, Young Americans for Liberty, that is handing out constitutions on campuses all across the country, has changed free speech restrictions on 25 campuses just by handing out this document, not by setting fires because they didn't like the speaker or throwing rocks through windows, but by handing out this constitution. And I am inspired that there are young people who are inspired by this document, and it should never be illegal to hand out this document.
Ms. Strawson, is Mr. Shapiro right? Are most of the anti-speech activities going on campuses targeted towards conservatives and libertarians?
Certainly the well-publicized ones have been. And I can't speak for campuses across the country, but I go back to an opening point that I made, which was best summarized in the title of a book by Nat Hentoff.
But I just wanted to answer. I can't. We'll come back to that. But I just wanted to respond to Mr. Shapiro's point. I mean, that's my understanding as well, and I'll be.
Those are the well-publicized incidents, and it would be consistent with what surveys show about the prevailing beliefs on campus, that the majority of students are on the liberal end of the political spectrum. The majority of faculty members are on the liberal end of the spectrum. So they would be more likely to be offended by
Professor Raskin, you're smiling. Speakers. You find that shocking too, don't you?
Now, it's interesting, Mr. Shapiro, you talked about white privilege. And just this week, I had a conversation with Rachel Lazar, who's done some work, a Jewish American woman who's done some work on this area, as well as having extensive conversations with Dr. Greg Parks of Wake Forest University, who's also talked quite a bit about critical race theory. And it's my understanding that white privilege is not telling individuals that they cannot speak, but it is a term for societal privilege that individuals have as a benefit of their white skin. And I don't think that, and I think universities would be remiss to then say that because you're white, you're not allowed to say anything that's critical of white people. I didn't know that white privilege actually went into that sphere. My understanding is it's just, and the issue is that white privilege makes people uncomfortable to talk about the societal privilege that they have.
Well, to me, what I say on campuses all the time is if you want to cite instances of racism that we can all find and fight together, that's something that I'm more than willing to stand next to you and fight, because that's obviously stuff that we should fight together. But when you just say that there is a white privilege out there in the ether and that by dint of birth your skin color generates for you an advantage, what you're really saying to people is that your view is less valuable because you have not experienced what I've experienced. And that is an identity argument, that's a character argument, that's not a rational political argument that can actually be taken on in any way. It's more of a cudgel and a club than it is an attempt to open a discussion.
Well, I think it's a demonstrable evidence that through society's demographics that being white has societal privileges that being black does not. But we can talk about how that manifests, because that's I'm also interested in what you just said now, is that you would stand next to anyone who has this. So, Mr. Shapiro, my question to you is, for Ms. Dunston, the tying the noose around the campus and writing messages that target African-American young students, would you consider that hate speech, and then would you stand next to her and fight for her?
As I say, this is the first I'm hearing about it, honestly, but...
Really?
Yeah, but from hearing about it, maybe because it's local, I mean, I'm from LA. But in any case, I'm more than happy to stand alongside her and fight whatever group was responsible for this. Not only more than happy, I mean, you're talking about the alt-right. Again, I was the #1 target of anti-Semitic harassment from the alt-right last year. So I'm more than happy to do all that. And I think there's one more distinction that has to be made. When we talk about cases like Taylor's, they're horrific, and the administration is siding with Taylor. Okay, the administration is doing the right thing by Taylor, or trying to do the right thing by Taylor, as they should be. And I think that we need to make a distinction between cases where the administration is actively participating in the suppression of speech and cases in which the administration is trying to do the right thing in order to punish people for application of crime.
What we are against is the teaching of contested political ideas as if they are accepted facts. We don't do this with communism, we don't do this with socialism, we don't do it with capitalism. And I want to speak about a dangerous trend in race relations that has come far too close to home to my life, and it is the promotion of critical race theory, an ideology that sees my blackness as victimhood and their whiteness as oppression. I want to be absolutely clear, this government stands unequivocally against critical race theory. Some schools have decided to openly support the anti-capitalist Black Lives Matter group, often fully aware that they have a statutory duty to be politically impartial. Black lives do matter, of course they do. But we know that the Black Lives Matter movement, capital BLM, is political. I know this because at the height of the protest, I've been told of white Black Lives Matter protesters calling, and I'm afraid I apologize for saying this word, calling a black armed police officer guarding Downing Street a pet nigger. That is why we do not endorse that movement on this side of the House. It is a political movement, and what would be nice would be for members on the opposite side to condemn many of the actions that we see this political movement instead of pretending that it is a completely wholesome anti-racist organization. There is a lot of pernicious stuff that is being pushed, and we stand against that. We do not want to see teachers teaching their white pupils about white privilege and inherited racial guilt. And let me be clear, any school which teaches these elements of critical race theory as fact, or which promotes partisan political views such as defunding the police without offering a balanced treatment of opposing views, is breaking the law.
Now, two quick questions. I want to get your view on the social construct of a safe space that universities like my own here at U Ottawa have tried to push on us.
Yeah.
And as well, I want to understand what your view on this whole white privilege thing is that universities like U Ottawa, U of T,
Yeah.
Ryerson, Yale, all these other universities are trying to cram down.
Yeah, well, I think the idea of white privilege is absolutely reprehensible. And it's not because white people aren't privileged. We have all sorts of privileges, and most people have privileges of all sorts, and you should be grateful for your privileges and work to deserve them, I would say. But the idea that you can target an ethnic group with a collective crime, regardless of the specific innocence or guilt of the constituent elements of that group, there is absolutely nothing that's more racist than that. It's absolutely abhorrent. I can't... Yeah. I mean, if you really want to know more about that sort of thing, you should read about the kulaks in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, K-U-L-A-K-S, because they were farmers who were very productive. They were the most productive element of the agricultural strata in Russia. And they were virtually all killed or raped and robbed by the collectivists who insisted that because they showed signs of wealth, they were criminals and robbers. So, one of the consequences of the prosecution of the kulaks was the death of 6 million Ukrainians from a famine in the 1930s. The idea of collectively held guilt at the level of the individual as a legal or philosophical principle is dangerous. It's precisely the sort of danger that people who are really looking for trouble would push. So, and just a cursory glance at 20th century history should teach anyone who wants to know exactly how unacceptable that is. With regards to your first, okay, there's the safe space issue, but you also said something right at the beginning. You announced your sexual preference at the beginning, and I understand exactly why you did that, but I have a comment about that. And this is something for people in the audience to think about. I've received at least 25 letters from transsexual people, and that's quite a few because there aren't that many transsexual people, right? So they're rare. They're very rare, and every single one of them but one was supportive. And the one that wasn't supportive was mildly critical. And they said exactly the same thing that you said, roughly speaking, is that, and so one of the things we want to remember is that just because some noisy activists stand up and say, because I'm a member of this group, or even worse, because I say I'm a member of this group, I am therefore an advocate for that group's interests, is we should just dispense with that self-identification as a worthy representative instantaneously, because it's predicated on the idea that one dimension of a person's identity is sufficiently what would you say, broad and all-encompassing, so that you can infer their political stance, for example, which you can't. And so the trans people that have written me, they all say the same thing. A, those people do not speak for me. B, we're not all the same. C, most of us think that the enforced pronoun issue is doing nothing but drawing negative attention to us. D, most of us just want to be referred to by the other pronoun. That's the whole point. So, so this has been very, very reassuring to me, because one of the things I presumed right from the onset was that there was no evidence whatsoever that this nonsensical legislation and the postmodern idiocy behind it is in fact demanded by this community, or that it will in any way be in anyone's best interest. No, I don't buy it. And I think it's rotten right to the core. So, and then the safe space issue. It's like, if you need a safe space, see a therapist. Really, university is not a safe space. If university is done right, it is a radically unsafe space. If you want to go somewhere and get yourself taken apart intellectually, and then hopefully put back together, then you go to university. Everything you believe should be challenged in every possible way, but not in a destructive sense, right? Like when you're renovating a house, you don't just burn it to the ground and walk away. That's what the postmodernists do to adolescence, by the way. You dismantle it in consultation with its occupant, attempting to build something more beautiful and functional on the foundation. It's not a safe space. In my classes, and I tell my students this right at the beginning, I'm trying to get them to understand why they are Nazis. Right, there isn't anything more unsafe than that. And all of them, virtually all of them, write back to me afterwards and say, this was the most worthwhile class I've ever had in my life, and it changed my life. It's like, well, I'm teaching you the worst possible thing about yourself. And your response is, oh, that was so useful, and I'm way better than I was. But it's in keeping with the idea that you need to be exposed to things that you fear and hate, because that's where salvation lies, roughly speaking. So,
white
yes.
privilege is a racist lie that is being taught to our kids. Am I right, King Face? It's a racist lie. And so I say this, like, oh, privilege. You know what real privilege is to the Brown students I was talking to, or the Dartmouth leftists? The real privilege is you guys are part of an elite country club in an Ivy League school that you'll be able to benefit from for the rest of your life. And you're trying to now all of a sudden that you're part of that ivory tower, now you're part of the ruling class, you're trying to say, oh, well, yeah, we're really against privilege. Now we want to, well, it's very easy to be a socialist when you've already made it. It's very easy to be generous with other people's money. You know when it's hard to be a socialist? When you're working 3 jobs at a local community college, and you're struggling and you're fighting, and you know that a little bit higher taxes or any changes in your health care could break you. That's when it's hard to be a socialist. It's easy to be a socialist when you go to Brown and you're being carted around in chauffeured cars, and you know nothing but luxury, and oh yes, I can recite all the wonderful socialist philosophers, and it's so wonderful. You are part of the ruling class, and guess what? President Trump and his policies have revitalized the middle class in this country unlike ever before.
Was there ever a point in history where white privilege did exist?
Yeah, I suppose when we lived in a country where if you were black, you were not allowed to go into certain places.
When did it end?
When it stopped being systemic, when there stopped being laws in place that stopped me as a black person doing what you're able to do as a white man. If you ask me whether or not I believe in economic privilege, I would tell you yes. If you ask me whether or not I think that somebody born into a family of billionaires will be afforded more privileges in life than somebody that is born in the projects of Chicago, I would say yes, because economic privilege in this country does exist. But there is no law in place that is stopping a person because of the color of their skin from gaining that economic privilege, which is why I do not believe that white privilege, which is based upon the color of your skin, exists. If you're asking me, do I think the black community has been crippled economically, the answer would be yes. It has been crippled economically by Democrat policies. You just heard me say that in there.
Democrats are Americans. Democrats are in America, so therefore you just admitted that there has been disadvantages by two black people by Democrats who are American. You just admitted it.
It is not based off. You asked me if white privilege exists. The answer is white privilege. Because you're born white, that means you're going to not have this or that. It does not exist. No. This is what I love about white liberals, right? Like, they know it's so important for them to sell us our oppression that they'll come up and tell us we're under grace. Just say it.
Can you speak for all
Well, why
black
don't you
people?
stop speaking for black people? That would be great, okay?
I'm not.
Why don't you let him, who's shaking his head and rolling your eyes, speak about his experience as a black man?
have a conversation later.
No, because you're sitting here yelling at me, telling me, and I'm telling you the answer. Economic privilege exists. You're saying why does it disproportionately affect blacks? Because we're disproportionately voting for Democrats, and it's
I
stupid.
just have to say that I object strenuously to your use of the word hilarious. To me, this feels a lot like your reaction to being named in one of these manifestos. Now, you're of course not responsible for the words of somebody writing that document, but I do think that laughing at it is a real problem, because these are real families that are impacted by this violence. And I think our efforts towards talking about this have to start from a place of mutual respect, which is what I've heard from this side of the table. Now, the reason we don't have those numbers, I want those numbers as much as you do, but to say the numbers don't show something is simply not supported by the data.
Okay, and I have 38 seconds left, Ms. Mulligan, if you want to respond within that time.
The only thing I would add is that it's in the name. Terrorism, domestic terrorism, it terrorizes us. It terrorizes us in our homes. It terrorizes us in our schools. And to the points made by the other panelists, it is disproportionate to its impact on any individual life, and it's not.
You reject the idea it's something that doesn't matter or doesn't really matter?
Absolutely reject.
Okay. All right, so here's where we are. Every member now has had 5 minutes and... Okay, and Mr. Clay, so we have 2 members who have not. So I'm going to go to the 2 members who have not yet, and we'll give an opportunity for a closing thought to any member who wants before we go.
Am I next to respond, or is Mr. Meadows?
I thought Mr. Meadows was next.
Mr. Meadows, okay.
Mr. Meadows is next, then Mr. Clay, then to you, Mr. Jordan.
Ms. Owens, obviously this is a gang up on you. You know, we're giving these witnesses the ability to do a rebuttal on you, and so you know, I find it unfair, Ms. Ballou. I mean, you know, candidly, for you to show mutual respect and then you to go after Ms. Owens, it's not appropriate. So, Ms. Owens, you can have 4 minutes and 34 seconds to respond. However,
yield for a second.
I'll yield.
Thank you. I believe, Ms. Owens, when you used the word hilarious, it was referencing the fact that no one had asked you a question. It wasn't to the subject matter of the hearing. Is that right?
That is correct.
And to have another witness insinuate something that is not accurate is just not appropriate, Mr. Chairman, for how witnesses are supposed to behave in front of this committee. I also think you didn't say it doesn't matter about the subject matter of today's hearing. You said there are other subjects that matter as well, and maybe we should spend some time on those. Is that accurate?
That is correct, and they matter much, 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 much more, and I have said that. I said that in my opening, and I will say it again. You know that white supremacy and white nationalism ranks nowhere near the top of the issues that are facing Black America. And the reason that you are bringing them up in this room is because it is an attempt to make the election all about race, as the Democrats
Not in my case, Ms. Owens. I'm sorry. Please do not characterize my motive.
Mr. Chairman, it's my time.
Yeah,
it's my time.
You've got your time, Mr. Meadows. I'll give you 3 more seconds.
Every 4 years, you bring up race, and you knew exactly what I meant when I said hilarious, and you just tried to do live what the media does all the time to Republicans, to our president, and to conservatives, which you tried to manipulate what I said to fit your narrative, okay? I was not referring to the subject matter that is hilarious. I said it's hilarious that we are sitting in this room today and I've got 2 doctors and a missus and nobody can give us real numbers that we can respond to so we can assess how big of a threat this is. Because you know that it is not as big of a threat as you are trying to make it out to be so that you can manipulate. And the audacity of you to bring up the Christchurch shooting manifesto and make it seem as if I laughed at people that were slaughtered by a homicidal maniac is, in my opinion, absolutely despicable. And I think that we should be above that. To try to assign reality or any meaning to a homicidal maniac writing a manifesto, which, by the way, let the record show, also stated Spyro the Dragon, the child's cartoon, as a source of inspiration. He also cited Nelson Mandela as a source of information. I don't think that Nelson Mandela has inspired mosque shootings. You can correct me if you think I'm wrong. You would rather assign meaning to a homicidal maniac than to actually address the things that I said today that are actually harming Black America. Number 1, father absence. Number 2, the education system and the illiteracy rate. Illegal immigration ranks high, abortion ranks high, white supremacy and white nationalism, if I had to make a list again of 100 things, would not be on it. This hearing, in my opinion, is a farce, and it is ironic that you're sitting here and you're having 3 Caucasian people testify and tell you what their expertise are. Do I know what my expertise are? Black in America. I've been Black in America my whole life, all 30 years, and I can tell you that you guys have done the exact same thing every 4 years ahead of an election cycle, and it needs to stop.
I'll yield back.
When you look at the organization, the people behind Black Lives Matter, what do you see?
There is no people. That's the problem. There is nobody behind Black Lives Matter. Who's the president of Black Lives Matter? Who are the people that are running Black Lives Matter?
A woman,
when you try to
a self-described Marxist.
Marxist. When you try to ask them, where is this money going? They have no offices. There is no organized cell, right? I mean, it's literally a terrorist organization. This is what you would expect if you were looking into the finances of ISIS.
What do you think of the rioting that's happening across the country? It continues to the day that we're speaking now.
I think that, either I have a crystal ball and I can see into the future, or this was the most predictable thing to possibly happen in the midst of an election cycle. I mean, I've been saying this, shouting this for the last 3 years. Get ready, Black America, because in 2020, we're going to watch Black people die. We're going to be told, that race issues are the worst that they've ever been, and we're going to be used like pawns, to further power for a political party that really is going to leave us behind if they get that power back. And it's happened. You can go back and watch me speaking for the last 3 years, and I've said this, and it's happened exactly as I said it's going to happen. These protests are remarkably funded. I don't care who you speak to. Nobody has the time or the patience to riot for months straight because one person was killed unarmed by a police officer. It's everywhere. It's everywhere you go. I mean, you even saw it. They were protesting in the UK about George Floyd.
Yes.
So this is way bigger. Antifa, it's organized. I mean, these people they've got bricks, they've got Molotov cocktails. We're looking at an organized cell of terrorism that's hiding behind the idea that they're trying to further civil rights. So I view Black Lives Matter as a terrorist group. I view Antifa as a terrorist group.
Yes.
And I think it's ridiculous to me that you have so many people that don't see that.
Now, as all things are in politics, it's condensed into 2 dimensions, of course. So when we talk about Black Lives Matter, I'm not aware of anybody who disagrees with the sentiment that Black Lives Matter. But the movement itself, there is disagreement. But to express that disagreement in public is to be construed as someone who doesn't care about Black lives. In other words, it's a strange situation you find yourself in. When you look at the organization, the people behind Black Lives Matter, what do you see?
There is no people. That's the problem. There is nobody behind Black Lives Matter. Who's the president of Black Lives Matter? Mm-hmm. Who are the people that are running Black Lives Matter?
A woman, a self-described Marxist.
A Marxist. When you try to ask them, where is this money going? They have no offices. There is no organized cell, right? I mean, it's literally a terrorist organization. This is what you would expect if you were looking into the finances of ISIS, right? There are no answers. There are a couple of people that say that they're leading it, but they have no employees. And that's the problem right now. We know that in the week that George Floyd died, they raised $50 million. Where did that money go? Are there schools? If Black Lives Matter, are we attacking illiteracy rates? What are they doing in the community that they've been able to raise $50 million under an LLC structure? They are not a 501c3 organization. That's the scary stuff, and nobody's being meant to answer these questions.
So whatever the mystery is behind their organization, you laid out some of it. There's no mystery to at least one of their goals, which is to defund the police.
Defund the police.
And what would the impact be of defunding the police on communities of color?
Yeah, I mean, what would the impact be? It's going to be, you're going to see the impact socioeconomically, right? So the people that are supporting this stuff, people that live in gated communities and have their own security guards, there'll be no impact. But we're seeing what that impact is right now in the inner cities. We're seeing in New York City when I think they reported 2 weeks ago a 267% increase in shootings and killings compared to the year before. That's what the impact is going to be. Right. There's not just this random vacuum that happens when you go, okay, we're going to get rid of the police, right? It doesn't mean that all of a sudden nothing happens. Somebody rises to take their place. That's going to be gangs that take those places, right? Because people are still going to look for some sort of a protection. This is the stuff that we got rid of in the 80s when New York City was really bad, right? Getting rid of the gang culture. You're seeing a return to that right now. We're seeing 1-year-olds being killed in the street. By the way, those 1-year-olds and those babies that are being shot and killed in the streets because they can't get any control over Chicago and Baltimore and New York City, they're not being buried in gold caskets like George Floyd. Yeah. It's incredible. And that's how you know this is political. This is not about Black lives. Stop pretending this is about Black lives. Everything that they're doing, everything about their mission is to harm Black lives. On their website, they've listed, they want to go against and to conquer the nuclear family, right? I mean, they're against families. They're anti-family. Go read Karl Marx, right? Go read the Communist Manifesto. That's exactly, it literally mirrors everything, and all of the Communist Manifesto's goals is what Black Lives Matter is after. And why do they want to destroy the family? Because it's the only way that government can replace family, right? You have to make sure that there's nothing else. There can be nothing else that competes with the word of the government. There can be no God. There's a strong layer of atheism that we're seeing, right? There can be no religion, there can be no God, there can be no dad, there can be no mom, there can be only selfishness and narcissism and rioting and protesting and anger. And what we're seeing is a communist movement that is taking hold in America.
But the idea of the destruction of the nuclear family being one of their goals, which you're right, it is. It's interesting because you're one of a very few people who know that, because the media at large certainly doesn't talk about it. If the average Black American knew that the purpose of the so-called Black Lives Matter movement was the destruction of the nuclear family, would they be for it?
No, and that's really what I spell out in my book is no. This is everything that you're seeing is actually anti-Black. Black people are naturally very conservative, right? We are the most religious group in America, right? We are the only group that has what's called a Black church. I mean, it's so, it's an odd thing to say, what is the Black church? But there is a Black church, and the reason for that, the reason that we have such a stronghold on faith and on family is because it had to mean so much to us because of our earlier oppressions. I mean, even in the Reconstruction era following slavery, the number one thing that Black Americans did when they got their rights back was get married. They went and they looked for long-lost relatives that were traded off onto different plantations. This stuff meant so much to Black America. Yeah. And now we're seeing an organization that was not put together by Black people, that is not funded by Black people, right? That money is not going to Black people, that is trying to strip away all of those things and say that they're doing it in the name of progressivism and because they want to be against racism. When actually, they're looking at the old playbook of what Democrats did when they had us as slaves and reintroducing it under this guise of progressivism. After Black Lives Matter ran all these crazy protests after Ferguson, the Black homicide rate actually went up 19% in this country because Black police officers across the board didn't want to do their jobs, okay? So Black Lives Matter is actually harmful to Black lives. And I will say this also, I will not whatsoever, ever take Black Lives Matter seriously, because if Black Lives mattered to Black Lives Matter, we would be talking about abortion, which has murdered 17 million, which has murdered 17 million Black babies since its inception. So if you want to talk to me about the 0.0004% of Black people that get unarmed Black men that get gunned down by police, you're going to first have to have a discussion to me about why you're not outside boycotting every single Planned Parenthood in this country. What you're seeing happening today, obviously we have some Black people that are just shouting in the back. We have some Black people that are sitting in the front quietly that are chanting USA and having a normal conversation. I love that, because what I say every single time, and you may have seen me on the news, is that what is happening right now in the Black community, you're going to hear it in this room first, there is an ideological civil war happening. Black people that are focused on their past and shouting about slavery, and Black people that are focused on their futures, okay? That's really what it comes down to, okay? I can guarantee you what you're seeing happening is victim mentality versus victor mentality.
That's
and I promise
great, by
you,
the way.
the people here are going to win.
I love that.
And there's no doubt in my mind. I can tell you right now who is going to be better off when we look 20 years and we look at the faces in this room. Who is going to be better off are the girls that are sitting right here and across this room, because they don't have your mentality. Victim mentality is not cool. I don't know why people like being oppressed. It's the weirdest thing I've ever heard. I love oppression. We're oppressed. 400 years of slavery, Jim Crow, which, by the way, none of you guys lived through. Your grandparents did. And it's embarrassing that you utilize their history. You utilize their history, and you come in here with more emotion than they ever had when they were living through it. More emotion than they ever had when they were living through it. It's embarrassing. You're not living through anything right now. You're overly privileged Americans.
Many see the slogan Black Lives Matter, or BLM, as a noble plea for equal treatment under the law. It's a cry to secure the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for everyone. But what does the Black Lives Matter organization actually stand for? To find out, look no further than their leaders: Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrisse Cullors. Here's Cullors in a revealing 2015 interview.
We actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists.
Visit the Black Lives Matter website and read the list of demands to get a sense of how deep a transformation they seek. One of those demands proclaims, quote, "We disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement by supporting each other as extended families and villages that collectively care for one another." We can't be certain, but it's hard to believe this radical agenda is what most signed up for when they made that hashtag Black Lives Matter social media post, or that every employee, customer, or shareholder at Nike endorses a disruption of the family. Garza first coined the phrase in 2013, the day George Zimmerman was acquitted of murdering Trayvon Martin. Her friend Cullors added the hashtag and joined the words so it could travel through social media. Tometi created the digital platform blacklivesmatter.com. According to Robert Stilson of the Capital Research Center, the group became a self-styled global network in 2014 and a fiscally sponsored project of a separate progressive nonprofit in 2016. This evolution has helped embolden an agenda vastly more ambitious than a national defunding of police. The goals of the Black Lives Matter organization go far beyond what most people think. They're hiding in plain sight, there for the world to see. If only we read beyond the slogans and the summaries of the movement they helped to create. It's a distinction with a profound difference. Their radical Marxist agenda is bent on supplanting the basic building blocks of society: the family, replacing it with the state, and destroying the economic system that has lifted more people from poverty than any other. Theirs is a blueprint for misery, not justice. It must be rejected.
It is time for this nation to stand up with one voice and to condemn and shun this movement called Black Lives Matter. I would like to see the Southern Poverty Law Center place Black Lives Matter alongside those other hate groups that were mentioned, these black nationalist groups, the Black Panther Party, the Nation of Islam. It doesn't mean that those organizations will go away just because they're on that list, but what happens is people start to delegitimize these movements and marginalize them. This movement needs to be marginalized. We have looked at this stuff. We have peeled back the layers. We've looked at the data. We've looked at the research. None of their false narrative about the use of force, about the American police officer, can be proved. None of it.
But why,
Zero.
how would that,
so
have,
it is
how
time.
would that have helped
But
this?
Megan,
You know, because this guy wasn't part of Black Lives Matter.
It is time for, he said, according to the chief down there, Chief Brown, he was doing this in the name of Black Lives Matter. He said he wanted to kill white people.
The language was a little different than that. He did say the latter.
Okay, but it is time for the liberal mainstream media, the New York Times editorial board, the CNN, MSNBC, to stop walking on eggshells and giving legitimacy to these rants, to all this false narrative coming out of this Black Lives Matter movement. Once we do that and marginalize this group, Then we can go about all the work. I listened to Loretta Lynch today. That was a great political statement, but nothing else. I don't need to be lectured to her about what we should or shouldn't do after this. I think she should have taken questions. Whenever you have an incident like this, somebody, the chief down there is doing a fabulous job of keeping the public informed. She came out, she intermingled this thing with some, gun control, this, that, and then just, took off. That was irresponsible. So once... the rhetoric I don't think is going to go away, but we need to delegitimize this Black Lives Matter movement. We've had enough of their nonsense.